All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Special thanks to Savi and Ethan for this really nice space, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how this develops. And thank you so much. And it's really nice to see so many people online for this. I'm quite conscious as being the first speaker of not trying to put everyone else out of kilter if I overrun. So I'll try to be strict with myself on time. So I'm just going to get straight into this. So most of my work is around notions of citizenship and security. So I really started work as an academic on citizenship testing. And so that's actually where I'm going to start, really, is the notion of citizenship in relation to language. And what we've seen, particularly, I mean, there are cases where there've always been tests for immigrants to become citizens. But we've seen a renewal, basically, of the connection between language and in relation to being a legitimate citizen. Now, obviously, these are kind of processes of wider contexts around language, race, and class in particular. So this quote, for example, is from Anne-Marie Fortier, who talked about, along with DJ Graham, talked about this idea of jus linguarum. So, I mean, the traditional notions of citizenship are around, jus sanguinis in terms of bloodlines, and jus terris, which means being a citizen of where you're born. But we've seen increasingly the way in which countries are using language tests as a way of gatekeeping, of redefining sovereignty and citizenship. So I'm really going to look at citizenship tests to begin with. Later on, I'm going to give a kind of another form of borders and the ways that borders function in another context, which on the face of it doesn't look like it's related to citizenship in the traditional sense, but you'll see it is. Just along the way, I'll just kind of point out the kind of social inequalities that are kind of drawn out from these issues, particularly in relation to language. So one of the things that Anne-Marie Fortier talks about in terms of this kind of renewal of really looking at citizenship is that it creates a distinction between what she refers to as citizenization and migrantization, which basically happened at the same time. So in effect, by kind of focusing so much on citizenship, it kind of reifies the difference between what's, a person who's considered a migrant or outside of the citizenry and citizens themselves. So, for example, citizenization really refers to contact with the state through administration, through the naturalization process, through tests, etc. And this kind of creates a kind of hierarchy because people who are already citizens who don't have to go through naturalization don't really have this kind of burden to deal with. So in this kind of redefinition and this renewal of citizenship, it also creates what has been, the idea comes from Derrida about the idea of being undecidable, that there's a kind of question mark above you until you can prove otherwise. And even if you prove otherwise, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be accepted as such. So within this, there's a kind of implicit kind of notion that the native speaker really is the ideal, with none of the testing that goes on in terms of citizenship, and already being a particular arbitrary level of language proficiency. All of this then means that the burden of conviviality is on migrants, basically. And all of this links to kind of ideas of integration. Now, one of the things that William Schinkel talks about is the way in which, particularly in Europe, so I'm always talking from our context here, that integration is kind of used as a kind of neo-colonial management of trying to make people assimilate in a particular way. And this is particularly borne out as this kind of failure of multiculturalism. So this is kind of what he talks about, is that this is a reality check, and that since multiculturalism is deemed to be a failure through many ways, there's kind of a renewed kind of punitive, harsher tone amongst European countries. So it kind of positions non-native speakers in particular, not all of them are treated in the same way, as being inherently problematic, and some even considered dangerous or threatening. So I position citizenship tests as borders rather than tests, and part of that is actually just borne out from my experiences of within my community, but also in terms of the kind of empirical work that we've done. Citizenship. So if I only focus on tests, we're only really looking at kind of the relationship between a test taker and a test, and it's quite dry and kind of limited in that respect. But position it within kind of border control, then it kind of draws our attention to the kind of inherent violence of border making and the particular ways in which these processes make effectively people unequal. So obviously this does, if we only focus on what tests are, we don't focus on what tests do and look at the kind of social impact of these. So here, then I'm positioning language as a kind of basically a border, and that the test scores in these cases represent a kind of sign that's to be decoded by other parties, whether it's on a political level, on a personal level, or through the administration of naturalization applications. Obviously, there's this massive racial linguistic perspective within this. I mean, I tend to focus on English in the UK, so it's obviously got kind of a colonial aspect to this, and it's just worth pointing out here that with England in the context of Britain, it's never been. It's only recently become a nation. It's always been an empire in many respects. So to think of English in those terms of expanding imperial borders through colonial conquest, but then kind of retracting those borders to keep people out, basically. So I'm just going to focus on two forms of borders. One is in terms of citizenship tests. So in the UK, then, the kind of new focus, I guess, new because maybe I'm showing my age, but the kind of the focus that we have in the 21st century is really goes back to 2001, and we had riots in 3 northern cities in the UK. Now, most of those riots were between British Pakistanis, British Bangladeshis, and the police and far-right extremists. Now, what happened over that summer was there was kind of tension that was building up amongst the far right, who were going into kind of former industrial towns, and basically being quite antagonistic and trying to create kind of anxieties about migrant communities. Now, the people involved didn't feel the police were being protective at all. And eventually it kind of spilled, and we had these kind of scenes in 2001. Now, what was significant about that was that 3 reports afterwards would effectively lay the blame on migrant communities, even though they were British by kind of legal terms, but they blamed a lack of English and a lack of a common language. And the idea was that people were leaving, and this is the famous phrase, parallel lives. And this created the tension, which became the precursor for the violence. So the government at the time, it was a Labour government, and they decided that there'd be a refocusing on citizenship and having a kind of a single national community and English language as this kind of way of bringing communities together. Now, it's worth pointing out this happened just a few weeks before 9/11. So by the time the reports came into play, there was this kind of framing of kind of similarities, basically effectively that both included large kind of Muslim communities and people, that this was kind of one way of framing what happened in New York with what was happening in the UK. And so we had citizenship tests. Now, that came out in 2002 through what's known as the Life in the UK test, and it's kind of changed in terms of its requirements over time. So you need it for citizenship, then you need it for indefinite leave to remain, which is our equivalent of permanent residency. You'll see that in 1981, we had a kind of, the legislation was in place. So the wording is that you need to have a sufficient knowledge of life in the UK and a sufficient knowledge of English. And that 1981 legislation is significant because it basically connected language requirements to British nationality. Believe it or not, we didn't actually have this idea of British citizenship until then. Before then, most people were considered to be part of the Commonwealth, or in some way kind of colonial kind of subjects, whether it's through Commonwealth or Empire. So that's a really significant moment in terms of carving out nationality compared to Empire before. So by linking all of this to violence and potential violence in the future, there's a kind of connection between security, basically, and citizenship and language. And now what tends to happen is through security literature is that security and insecurity go together. So you effectively take away one from the other in search of having control over the sovereignty. So we talk about insecurity in this respect. So if we're defining security as being kind of monolingual, and that, you know, native speakers effectively contribute to this naturally, then migrants, multilingualism, and other languages kind of contribute to the insecurity. So I'm just going to show quickly then in terms of just some of the social inequalities that come out through this. So this was one project that we did at the University of Leicester a few years ago, and we kind of interviewed about 158 people, and kind of all different parts of the citizenship journey. One of the things I want to focus on is this particular area where inequality shows up in two ways, in a couple of ways. One is in terms of gender, time, and money, basically. So it also links to social class. One of the things that kept coming up was access to support for the test. So there's been a massive reduction in the amount of funding that's available for English language classes. And so that effectively means people are on their own in terms of trying to find support. Now, we found, because we interviewed, I think it was 90 women in this, 60 of which were around 60 were mothers, so childcare was a real issue. So you just see in this extract, we couldn't say the nations that people were from in this, so we had to keep it a little bit vague for quite reasonable kind of ethical issues that we were coming across. But we see here that you know, here the classes are charging over £150. And you can just see on that first line, if I don't do it now, before you know it, again, it's £200. So there's this kind of fear that if you don't take advantage now, the prices will go up. And, you know, this is what we referred to as defensive naturalization, where people are trying to deal with something before it happens, such as a rising cost. So, you know, how do you want us to get it? One, charging us each time, and I have children and I can't leave my children. And so it was doing the opposite of integration. It was actually doing the opposite, which was to kind of isolate people more and more. This is just another case here where another person in a college where English was taught, basically. My husband, he works full-time, so every time when I go to study and no, you need to pay, it's really big high fee for the childminder. So £8 or £9 an hour. So it depends on how many hours I need. So that was referring to how many hours you would need to kind of have the kind of level, or to be able to even just deal with the kind of context of the test itself. So for me, a mum, I was quite busy, plus 2 kids. I do every day 30 minutes reading the book, and I feel myself a bit tired, and I didn't understand anymore, and I just leave it. So this person actually was a nurse, for example, who's functioning, you know, working really well in ordinary life, but for whatever reason, just really struggled with the test. So it's just worth pointing out here that the test is kind of 24 questions. You have to use a computer, and it's multiple choice. And all you've really got is one preparation book. And if you can't get support from that, then it becomes quite difficult. So that's just one example there where the kind of reality of such tests, where they promise integration and all these kind of things, the citizenship, really doesn't play out, and it makes people more isolated. And, you know, some of the most vulnerable people, the marginalized people in the kind of groups that we were interviewing, it really came out through that. So one of the things, just to point out while I'm there, is that obviously this is things that people, if you already have citizenship and, you know, you don't have to do these things, you just don't have to deal with, right? So it's that kind of imposition that's being placed on migrants. This is just another case. So I started researching this, and the lockdown happened, so I wasn't able to kind of follow through this. But I just want to kind of draw your attention to other contexts. So this is the Spanish citizenship test, which is relatively new. It's been there since about 2016, 2015. So there's 2 tests here. One is the one on the right, which is the DELE, which is kind of generic Spanish language test of reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Now, obviously, that test wasn't made with this purpose in mind, but they also have a civic knowledge test, which is the one on the left. And this is the phenomena that I'm just about to explain was something I was researching and just got hit by COVID and couldn't follow it. But I'm just going to share this newspaper title here just to explain the context of this. What was happening was that the police in Spain were interrupting citizenship tests and actually entering the exam itself, and then checking people's identities during the test. And yeah, they're quite militarized police in Spain, and you know they carry weapons, and it's incredibly intimidating. But that just shows you again, types of things that people have to deal with, the type of border control and security that goes into these things. I'm hoping to pick up that project again later, but I just want to draw your attention to those type of things that go on. So the second type of bordering I just want to talk about here is my current work. So I'll just show you the context of this because it'll take a while to get the kind of results from this. But so I was in Copenhagen, and one of the things that they have there is what's known, believe it or not, as the ghetto policy. And the idea in Denmark is that particular areas are designated ghettos. And the goal of the government is to eradicate these kind of designated ghettos, right? So what makes a ghetto a ghetto? Well, there's a few things that meet the criteria. One is in terms of unemployment, one is in terms of crime, one is in terms of education, and number 4 is income. Now, this actually connects to an overall counter-extremism program as well, but you'll see with the next criteria how racial this is. And I just want to draw your attention to the middle part of the circle, which says half or more of the residents are of non-Western descent. So actually with this, it doesn't actually make a difference if you're naturalized or not. It goes back, a couple of generations. So you might be asking here, then, what's non-Western? So red is Western and blue is non-Western, so excludes North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So highly racialized. Now, again, what's the role of language within all of this? Well, under these laws, here it says 1 year old. I always get different kind of ideas of the ages, but kind of what are considered ghetto children are tested for their language ability in Danish. And if they're considered to be, not sufficiently proficient enough, then they're separated from their parents for something like 25 hours a week in childcare, where they have full immersion in Danish values and Danish language. So one of the things I'm looking at the moment is in terms of how parents deal with this. But again, we're not talking about naturalization here, but we're kind of looking at kind of tiered citizenship and the role that language kind of helps in mediating this. So what all of this leads to is what Barnor Hess talks about is racial indecidability, that there is always a question mark over particular people. Now, maybe they get through this and it's fine, but the fact that there's a threat there is what's the real kind of problem here. Now, this opens people up to potential harm and exclusion, even whether it's not being able to access rights or being separated from your children and all the kind of markers that will have for the rest of their lives. One of the things I was trying to make clear here is that the idea of focusing on the assessment and test aspect is always a kind of red herring in some ways, because people, particularly language testers, want to focus, from my experience at least, on improving the test or making better assessment. That's actually kind of the wrong part of the equation that we're looking at. We need to be looking at why we have these things in the first place and the kind of violences that they're creating. So all of this then places people, again, to use a kind of phrase from Derrida, languages in the ear of the other, right? That the state or people working on behalf of the state are able to kind of make these judgments about families, about people, which can, have quite big consequences. And, it's a particularly high stakes kind of assessment that's going on, whether it's through the ghetto policy or through naturalization and quite often, I mean, I didn't have time today, but all of these things have an impact on families, right? So we see the force of the laws of this all legal kind of stuff that's kind of pushed through policy and through language testing. So really, as I said, focusing on improving assessment in this respect and kind of the idealization of particularly native speakers, then all that really does is sharpen the policy instrument. And I would encourage people to think kind of more imaginatively about this. So just to conclude, just general questions, because I wasn't quite sure of the kind of audience and I'm trying to appeal to everyone, but how do notions of citizenship, language and race align through these kind of things, these contexts? Also to think about the hierarchization of particularly where native speakers are aligned with being authentic citizens, how that aligns with the stratification of other people within this. And finally, just that Sorry. How does the production of citizenship intertwine with the development of the security state? So just in both cases, there are different types of security in different ways, about counter-extremism or kind of reaffirming the national community. But, I'd encourage people to think about, the ways these things happen. Okay, so I'm going to finish it there. We also in Birmingham, we have a group for multilingualism. Everyone's always welcome to join our group, and we have activities, and if anybody people are always welcome to come as visitors as well if you're interested. I'm going to stop it there just to keep on top of time, and I'll pass it over to Ethan and Savi.